imagery will show this, is the helicopter comes in and they make contact with the ungrounded spacecraft. The armed hatch blows. The water starts pouring into the spacecraft. Gus, somehow, he's 5'7", he somehow manages to get out. So this, we lose the spacecraft. Gus Grissom's in the water for 5 minutes, nearly drowns. It's the first real emergency in American space flight, and there are attempts to find out what has really gone wrong here. But we'll make the point that the NASA investigators never were able to duplicate the conditions on July 21st, 1961, 300 miles out in the Atlantic. And these, we think, play a role in what we believe happened. So, and the other thing here, of course, is that even though there was an investigation, the blame for this tended to shift, as Robert Vos of NASA said, toward the astronauts. So Gus ended up referring to all of this throughout the end of his short life as the hatch crap, something he had to deal with. Let's go to the next slide, Andy. So we think that this is a plausible scenario. John Reinhard, who you'll see in the recovery footage, is standing in the side door of the primary recovery helicopter, Hunt Club 1. When he reaches down to snip that antenna with a device called a cookie cutter, he said that he observed an arc. John Reinhard is the closest person to the spacecraft at this moment. He reports seeing an arc. And what happened was that the cookie cutter had two squib actuated cutters on separate circuits. Luckily, Reinhard had the antenna in the yoke and they fired automatically. He did not fire them. And that was at the moment he observed the arc. He didn't see the hatch actually blow off, but or explode, but he did see it blow away from the spacecraft. And about 5 seconds later, he observed Gus Grissom coming out. And Andy's used some of this sequence to show what we think happened. So the question is, what role did electrostatic discharge play in the hatch explosion? We talked to people who worked on the spacecraft. We talked with people who were familiar with recovery training, the qualification of components, and so forth. And we found lots of inadequacies in this recovery sequence. We also determined that the materials that were used in the mild detonating fuse that would blow the hatch were highly sensitive to electrostatic discharge. And these procedures were all changed after the flight of Liberty Bell 7. Let's go to the next slide, Andy.
I think that's over to me, George.
Yeah, so at this point, we're at the 11 minutes of the most dangerous part of the flight of Liberty Bell 7, the time from which Gus Grissom splashes down to the point where he's hauled up and into a backup helicopter in that horse collar, sort of that lasting image of Gus looking like a dead fish getting pulled out of the water. So Andy, why don't you take it from here?
Yeah, thanks, George. So to try and corroborate Reinhard's statements and his recollections, we looked at, we did some photographic analysis. George contacted me about a year ago to look at this. One important thing to do with this kind of analysis is to use the highest quality source footage available. That took us months to track down. The National Archives were closed for COVID. We tried National Geographic, but I was convinced there was a better source out there. And Stephen Slater, who I think you know at the History Office, he's an archivist, brilliant archivist, came up trumps and generally supplied us with a HD transfer of the recovery film. Another important thing is to look at this completely objectively, so to not try to see things that aren't there in what is quite low quality footage, or to try and come up with an answer, but just to assess it completely objectively. And that's where George was quite clever when he first contacted me, is he simply said, can you find the moment that the hatch blows? And that was the starting point. So I enhanced this high quality footage that we got hold of, went through this frame by frame. The first job was to say, can we find the moment that the hatch blows? And they did that by looking for any movement at all around the capsule. Some of the digital processing techniques applied, I will go through these a bit more as they were used, but upscaling, some image stabilization because the camera's moving a lot, artifact removal, some bits of dust and whatever that can be on the film, basic contrast and levels adjustment, and kind of non-basic image stacking, which is a bit more of a complex process, which we got into further towards the end of the analysis. So this is an opening shot. This is a raw shot at the start of the most important sequence of the recovery. This was filmed by a third helicopter, we believe by Dean Conger from the National Geographic. And the role of this helicopter was to film the recovery. But as you can probably tell, it's quite a challenging piece of film in that we're a long way from the subject. It's shot into the sun. So everything we're interested in is in silhouette. It's small format film, so there's lots of, I don't know if it's come across on Zoom, there's lots of noise on there that's inherent in small format film and artifacts. And as I said, the camera is moving in a moving helicopter and the capsule is bobbing in the ocean. So when you zoom in, it's even less clear than it appears here. But we have to start somewhere. So I went through frame by frame this whole sequence, and all I could find in terms of movement near the capsule was in 17 consecutive frames. Now that's quite important because if it was an artifact or some noise, or in terms of digital noise or something else, it would typically be on one frame. It wouldn't be in 17 consecutive frames. And those frames also move in an upward and outward direction from the capsule. So once I identified this, that still wasn't that clear. That's when the sequence you're about to see is stabilized, the camera stabilized, the capsule is stabilized, lots of obvious artifacts have been removed just to make it as clear as possible. And this is about 0.7 of a second in terms of elapsed time, these 17 frames. What's also important, you'll see this at the start of the film, is I've imposed, you'll firstly see a couple of seconds later, Gus Grissom climbing out of the capsule. And the reason that's there is from the silhouette, I couldn't tell exactly where the hatch was. So using this later frame, we could rescale it, superimpose it onto this part of the film so we could identify exactly where the hatch is against the silhouette. And lo and behold, this movement comes from exactly where the hatch is. So we'll just play this. So there's Gus climbing out. So that arrow is where the hatch is. Now that's played forward. We'll play it backwards now in reverse. And it almost looks like this matter, whatever it is, in reverse is kind of being sucked back into the capsule. I think it's clearer in reverse, which is why it's played forwards and then backwards. So it's quite key this. So I'll play this one more time. There's Gus getting out. So we know the hatch is here and this dark matter going out. And then that's it in reverse, then out. So it's not absolutely conclusive. We can't see from this quality of film if that's definitely a hatch. But given that it's coming from that location and it's not film artifacts, it's looking likely. So in terms of, we'll just take one of those frames, an example. It tends to consist of a smaller, quite solid, dark object, could well be the hatch, amongst a wider, larger area of slightly less dense object, which I think is ocean spray. Now that actually ties in with Grissom's statement that as soon as the hatch blew, water started to pour in to the hatch. So we'd expect then that because as you can see, the capsule is listing at this stage quite severely due to the prop wash, that we would expect to see some ocean spray as the hatch blows. It also backs up what you said about the ocean coming straight in. That wouldn't happen. That wouldn't come over the sill if the spacecraft was perfectly upright. But because it's listing, the bottom of the hatch is probably close to that waterline. So we think this could well be the hatch blowing. But what's happening with Hunt Club 1? Because Reinhard said, as I touched the antenna, that's when the hatch, he saw the arc, and that's when the hatch blew. So this is the very, very beginning of those frames, those 17 frames. This is a single frame that I've enhanced in a different way to now try and pull that detail out of the silhouette. And unfortunately, it's just not there, as you can see. It's very pixelated. We can see some orange here. That's probably Reinhard. But what's happening? He looks also, the helicopter looks quite away from the capsule. So could he really be cutting the antenna at that point? So this is where I employed a stacking process, which I did on the Neil Armstrong image. I use a lot in the book. Whenever I try and explain this, it's not easy to explain, but I'll try it just very briefly in this way. If you imagine on the left here, we've got some 16mm small format film from Apollo 14, the Shepard, the command module. If you were to take those 4 frames and slice them with scissors, you know, this film's quite transparent, and then you stack them on top of each other, like you can see here, and perfectly align the image and then squash them, the image itself, the signal or the image, is in the same place on every frame, and that will be consolidated and it becomes stronger. But the noise is completely random, and it's random on every frame. So some noise that's at this location on his hand in frame 1, it won't be there in frame 2 or frame 3, and we might not see it again until frame 20. So when you consolidate lots of frames, you keep the signal, but you average out the noise. And so the signal to noise ratio improves, and we can pull out more detail. So we started with this single frame, but we wanted to know what is happening just here in Hunt Club 1. And with the stacking process, which is those 17 frames plus a few extra, so it covers 1 second of elapsed time at the moment that we saw the hatch blow, and we now get this. And lo and behold, there is in the hatchway, in the doorway of Hunt Club 1, is John Reinhard. He's his legs. This is his, if you can see my cursor, this is his right elbow. His helmet, you can see a bit of orange there, that's his life vest. His left arm's holding on to a pole. And that pole you can see against the dark backdrop of the helicopter is pointing towards the capsule. But it disappears once we have a bright background. So this started to get very interesting. But could that pole have reached the capsule in this moment? So simply superimposing a line on the bit of the pole that we can see and extending it forwards, we see it intersects an area above the capsule that, lo and behold, is exactly where we know that the antenna was cut. And we can see that from this inset image from a later point in the recovery. In terms of the length of the pole, on the right here, we've got a later point in the footage, which is clearer because we got closer to the subject. And this is a separate pole. This is the shepherd's hook pole that they use to hook on to Liberty Bell. And scaling that image and taking the length of that pole, we found that it would indeed be long enough. So almost without question, this is the exact moment that John Reinhard is clipping the antenna. And that ties in exactly with what he stated. He saw an arc at this moment, and this is precisely the moment that we've witnessed those 17 frames of movement that happen to come from exactly where we know the hatch is. So it could be an extraordinary coincidence, but we don't think so. So we'll summarize this very shortly. I just wanted to show these couple of clips, extra clips that I haven't put out yet, that have been stabilized, upscaled and enhanced, just to show this is the moment that Gus enters the water. It must have been a pretty terrifying ordeal. You can see on his right hand, we think he's holding on to a bunch of cables that sit behind the instrument panel. And that's how he's balanced himself as he goes into the water. You can see the antenna is cut at this point at the top.
I think you see his helmet too, Andy.
Yeah, just about bobbing up. And then this, well, I'll play this one twice. So if we focus on Grissom, first of all, in the bottom right, if you watch, he actually swims towards the capsule, which is as it's sinking, which is obviously incredibly dangerous, but he's keen to recover the capsule. You see him actually gets his hand on the top ring. And I'm convinced if Reinhard hadn't have hooked on, Gus would have reached over and hooked that on himself. As it happened, he did hook on, and then you'll see Grissom move back, and you'll see him give the double thumbs up to say, yes, you hooked on, whilst he's treading water under all that prop wash. So I'll just play. So you see Grissom here on the right, and he's swimming in, and he's on the capsule, but we're hooked on. The helicopter moves away, and they'll give us I'll give the recovery guys the double thumbs up. Now, if we just play it one more time, if you look at Hunt Club 1, you'll see Reinhard hook on, and as they pull away and the line tightens and Liberty Bell starts to sink, you'll just see the jolt that happens to the helicopter. And then you'll see Reinhard drop the pole and he'll wave with his left hand to Gus as if to say, we're hooked on, move away to safety. If we look at Hunt Club 1 now, there's Reinhard with the pole, he hooks on. The wheels of the helicopter are actually in the water at this stage. And then the line here pulls tight and the helicopter gets quite a jolt. And then there's Reinhard with his left hand saying, you know, move away to safety. So in terms of conclusions, we've identified this movement in 17 consecutive frames, which can't be film artifacts from the exact location of the hatch. So we do think this is highly likely the moment that the hatch blows. It also ties in with the fact that 5.2 seconds later, we see Grissom egressing from Liberty Bell 7. And that matches his statement. He said, I've never moved faster. So if you imagine water's pouring in and you're trying to get out, although it's difficult, he grabbed hold of the instrument console to pull himself out. 5 seconds sounds reasonable. So that matches what he said. The fact that water poured in over the door sill matches the fact that it was listing, and the fact that we could see the ocean spray as well as the hatch potentially. And at that exact moment, we can now show that Reinhard was indeed cutting the antenna, which validates his statement and his recollection and timeframes. I clipped the antenna, I saw an arc, the hatch blew, and Grissom egressed. Now, one reason that some explanations in the past, including this one, have hit a bit of a buffer is because that one eyewitness is just one eyewitness. And it differed slightly to what Jim Lewis remembered. And his recollection, he was the pilot of Hunt Club 1. But we've shown Jim all of our analysis, all of this enhanced footage. And after 60 years, he said, actually, I need to reconsider my memory banks. You know, this very likely is the moment the hatch blew. So we've now got Grissom, Reinhard and Lewis all on the same page. So things are looking quite likely. But could it have been electrostatic discharge? Well, we know that happened to the cookie cutter. This had happened before in training. It was Peter Armitage in his NASA history interview. And he stated this happened to him during training. So we know it happened, particularly if the aircraft is ungrounded. Could it have set off the explosives as well as the pyrotechnic squibs in his pole? Could it have set off the hatch? Well, given that even just the timing, it seemed extremely coincidental. But also, as George mentioned, we know the percussion caps likely contained mercury fulminate. And we've had the date sheet from that. And under the part that says static electricity, it explodes, unfortunately. So all in all, based on all the available evidence, including the enhanced imagery, we conclude that electrostatic discharge is the most plausible cause for the premature explosion of the Liberty Bell 7 hatch. And finally, after 60 years, hopefully, this would now exonerate fully Gus Grissom from any blame. And George, I don't know if, I mean, you were the instigator of this whole process. I don't know if you want to add anything in terms of.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one or two things just in terms of how we vetted this. And we wanted to be extremely careful. And we ran this by folks who worked at NASA at the time on things like training and the qualification of Project Mercury components. Folks like Bob Voas, who you may know, who was involved in astronaut selection, and people who worked on the spacecraft itself. And one of the things that they told us was that, you know, each spacecraft component has to be qualified. And there's a serious question here as to whether this hatch was rushed onto the spacecraft and whether it was properly qualified. It sounds like it wasn't. Bob Voas told us that the exploding hatch, was sort of a Johnny-come-lately thing. We are aware of at least one test of the hatch where Gus Grissom observed it, but we really don't think that he was intimately familiar with how the hatch operated. Again, you got to remember that they were more concerned about getting an astronaut up and down, and the recovery procedures were sort of an afterthought. I mean, there was serious rehearsal and so forth, but it sort of came at the end of all of the other training that these three early astronauts had to undergo, and it looks like the recovery training was sort of received short shrift in the mission planning. And part of the proof of this, I think, is that this recovery procedure was never used again. That in later flights, the astronauts decided not to go near this hatch, and they would only blow the hatch until they were on the deck of the primary recovery ship. The exception was Scott Carpenter's flight, where he went up the top. But as I said, the fault for this sort of devolved onto the astronaut, and this was like the worst thing that could happen, losing your ship. This is the only ship Gus Grissom ever lost, and he had to live with it for the rest of his life. And I think through, just a series of coincidences, he did get the maiden flight of two American spacecraft. So I think that his reputation was restored, but this was something that he had to live with for the rest of his life, as did his family. So one of the reasons I wrote the book and why I contacted Andy is I wanted to clear up this nonsense about Gus Grissom panicking. You don't become an astronaut. You don't fly a ballistic trajectory if you're going to panic once you hit the water. If anything, at the end of Gus's flight, he would have been relieved.
And
so
could you hear that in the audio files, George, that we listened to, couldn't you? That, Hunter Bob thinks, "Are you ready?" And he said, "No, I'll be a few minutes. I've got some things to finish off. I'll let you know when I'm ready." He's very calm in the audio as well.
Yeah. So it was important for us, and we thought the 60th anniversary was the time to release this footage. And I would just, before we take questions, Brian, I just want to make one other point, and that is that Andy's really stellar work on this I think, is a byproduct of a free and open American space program. It's an enterprise in which we make mistakes and we fix them. And we did this on Project Apollo after the fire, and that's how we reached the moon by the end of the 1960s. And I would argue that we couldn't have done any of this without the extraordinary efforts of guys like Gus Grissom. So let's take some questions, Brian, if we have some.
All right, very good. I enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed, reading, seeing all the material that you guys put out. Hearing that kind of walk through like that is incredible, amazing. The work it takes to, both to get the visuals, Andy, what you were talking about, in order to layer, and all this work that you do to get these incredible images up. I mean, that's really important. George, you kind of, just to start us off, you kind of mentioned this a little bit just now, but why is it that this issue resonates so much, with at the time, why did it resonate so much, and why has it continued to resonate so much, this question of...
Well, I lost you right up there at the end, Brian, but I think I got the gist of your question. A lot of it goes back to Tom Wolfe. And Tom Wolfe wrote a fantastic book about the early space program, and I think it renewed interest in what these guys did and the huge risks that they took. But he made one error, in my judgment, and that was this baloney about Gus Grissom panicking once he got in the water. And I think people who knew Gus realized, it was invented. It didn't happen. Gus wasn't no longer alive, so he couldn't defend his reputation. But one of the reasons I wrote the book was I wanted to straighten out the record on this, about something that simply didn't happen. And I think it resonates with folks. I think Gus is sort of viewed as the blue collar astronaut, the guy who came up from a little Indiana town and got to the top of the Right Stuff pyramid. And I think people appreciate that. I think people, we're looking for heroes, and I think Gus Grissom is one of them.
Very good. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get to the questions in the chat here. It's let's see. Yeah, Will is going to ask. Will asks, would recovering the hatch provide proof?
Yeah. So we worked. I failed to mention we worked closely with Kurt Newport, and Kurt is the fellow who recovered Liberty Bell 7 from 16,000 feet of water in 1999, and he encouraged us to pursue this. He ran out of time and money, and he couldn't find the hatch. But yeah, the hatch would probably provide some corroboration for what we're arguing. But talk about a needle in a haystack. It was hard enough to pinpoint and then figure out how to get this spacecraft back up. But he didn't have time or money to go get the hatch. Maybe Jeff Bezos can fund that one next. But yeah, it probably would provide some additional technical details about the sequence that we've just described. But again, I think, and I want to emphasize that we ran this by Jim Lewis. And for 60 years, Jim Lewis, the other eyewitness, insisted that the hatch blew when he was on his final approach. And when Andy first showed me the enhanced footage, I said, oh boy, it looks like he's too far away. But he was certainly much closer. They were much closer than Jim Lewis had originally indicated, that he was in final turn. They were right over the spacecraft. And the thing you also have to remember is you got 80-degree water temperatures, and that helicopter, the last piston-driven helicopter in the Marine Corps fleet, was generating a huge amount of prop wash. And if you look at Coast Guard or U.S. Navy manuals, you always would ground anything before you touched it. So these procedures were all changed after this incident. As Andy mentioned, a guy named Peter Armitage went out on a training mission, and the guys in the helicopter knew what was going to happen. He said, would you like to try it? He touched a boilerplate spacecraft and got zapped. So this had happened before.
And the Marines fell about laughing. So it obviously happened to the Marines as well previously. So it's a nice joke. But what it shows is this was an expected event.
Yeah. And again, Reinhard was unequivocal in what he said he saw and the location of the helicopter when he observed this arc.
Very good. We'll also ask a kind of follow-up question here. Were the cookie actuator supposed to fire automatically, or do you think that was also an ESD event?
No, he would have had to have fired them himself, and they were on separate circuits. And this was what was most striking, was he said I reached down and they fired by themselves, and luckily he had the antenna in the yoke, so it did sever the antenna.
And this pole was designed. It's started from, I think, Peter Armitage's garage. You know, he had a tree pruning pole.
It's a tree pruner. And
that's what he took to, was it Dahlgren, to see, well, can we come up with something that happens more automatically and is a stronger cut? So there was two blades and each had a pyrotechnic squib. And so once he pressed those switches, pyrotechnics would go and snip the antenna. And luckily, as it went off, it happened to be in the yoke at the time. So it did snip the antenna. So it worked, but not in the way it was intended.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of answers Bill Higgins' question too. How did they work? You know, how did the cookie cutter work? So let's see here. Sarah asks, what was the moment like when you realized that it was most likely caused by static electricity and that you'd be able to exonerate such a great astronaut? Sarah says that must have been thrilling.
Well,
so what is that moment of discovery like, I guess?
Let me start, and then Andy can chime in as well. We need to acknowledge some early work, along with Stephen Slater's great video. A guy named Rick Booz, who is in my book, and he's also in another book by Colin. Oh man, I can't think of Colin's last name. I apologize, Colin. But he also he ran down the Peter Armitage stuff. So we were aware of this. I was very careful in the book because we didn't have the images Andy produced, but there was eyewitness testimony saying that this is another possibility. There were several possible explanations, like the landing bag straps getting caught in an exterior lanyard. I should have mentioned the plunger on the detonator took 5 pounds of pressure, and there was an external way of detonating the hatch with a lanyard, which would have required 40 pounds of pressure. Gus Grissom and other people thought that perhaps the landing bag straps the cushion when you splash down. Might have gotten caught in this lanyard when it deployed, but Kurt Newport discounts that idea, as do the Mercury, the McDonnell aircraft engineers that we interviewed who worked on the spacecraft. They said it didn't make any sense, and to them, they thought that electrostatic discharge made the most sense, was the most plausible explanation for what happened based on their knowledge of how the spacecraft operated.
Yeah. From the image point of view, it feels amazing. I think the moment when although I do this a lot, I'm always surprised myself at just how much you can pull out of old film, particularly with the stacking process. And I had this when I produced the Neil Armstrong image, and suddenly I could see a recognizable Neil Armstrong image, and I was just right there with Aldrin in the lunar module thinking, I don't think anyone has seen this in this way for 50 years, and such historical footage. But I think that moment when I'd stacked those images of the helicopter and there was Reinhard with a pole at the exact moment we'd found what we think is the hatch, I mean, that just couldn't be coincidence, or it would be an astonishing coincidence. So at that moment, I thought, this is it. George,
I see a question from Stephen Slater about the onboard film. The foot, you've seen Glenn and Shepard. You can see them in the spacecraft during the flight. There's also film of Gus Grissom that went down with the ship. And to answer Stephen's question, that film was recovered. As far as I know, it's in storage at the Cosmosphere in Kansas, where Liberty Bell 7's permanent home is. And I understand I think it's stored in some sort of liquid, but it's never been restored. So if anybody can find the money and the equipment to do that, it would be another really good piece of evidence.
Yeah, my understanding was it would be damaged beyond use, but perhaps someone hasn't.
Yeah, years in seawater under that kind of pressure. I don't know what kind of shape it's in, but maybe Andy and Stephen can work on that next.
That sounds like a good project.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see. We've got a question here. Did the incident change the way access hatches on spacecraft were designed, or recovery procedures? Space shuttle hatches were propulsive, if I recall.
Well, as I said, this same recovery procedure was not used again. John Glenn, Wally Schirra, and Gordo Cooper all chose to blow the hatch on the deck of the recovery ship. And some of you may be familiar with this story about Wally Schirra. When he hit the plunger, it had a nasty kick, and he said it cut through his glove and either bruised or cut his hand. And when he got out of Sigma 7, his ship that did six flaps, he walked up to Gus Grissom and said, "Look, Gus, look what the recoil on the plunger did to my hand." And they used this to say Gus didn't have that injury on his hand, so he obviously didn't hit the plunger on the detonator. So this is another piece of exculpatory evidence, but it wasn't, I don't think, as definitive as what Andy's turned up. The the Mercury guys were very tight-knit, and they closed ranks on this issue. And I think, they learned from their mistake, and and of course they learned from the Apollo 1 fire. That was the biggest change in hatch design, a quick opening hatch to get out in a hurry. So, these guys were making stuff up as they went along. It's incredible that they could make all of these components work as they did. And it was just Gus's poor luck that it happened on his flight and he lost his ship. But, we learned and we made it. We did what we said we were going to do.
All right. Yeah, I think you answered another question that was in the chat with that. Pat was about the other Mercury astronauts and the damage to their hands from the plunger. Right. Let's see. Looks like Deborah is asking here, when you report against and this is a great question, right? So when you report against this sort of accepted history version, sometimes those who believed it the longest are reluctant to change their minds. Did you get a lot of pushback on this reporting, or did you, along the way, have you felt that there's a little bit of resistance to changing the narrative, I guess?
I didn't see any, George. I don't know about yourself. In fact, a lot of people that are interested in spaceflight kind of know Gus didn't panic and didn't hit the chicken switch, and a lot of people are said negative things about what is otherwise a pretty good movie. So most of the feedback that I saw was, great, this substantiates what we all probably knew anyway, and also likely what NASA believed internally, at least, although they didn't necessarily express that full support for Gus externally, giving him the, to become commander of the first Gemini mission and then the commander of what would have been the first Apollo flight, I think speaks volumes. So I think most of those that understand the history of spaceflight knew that this was the case, and I haven't seen much pushback. Don't know about you, George.
Well, I think the big moment for us was when we pulled this together and we showed our results to Jim Lewis, who was the only eyewitness left. And as I said, for 60 years, he insisted he was on his final turn when the hatch blew, well away from the spacecraft. And when he saw Andy's footage, he said, "You've jogged my memories." I think Andy quoted him as saying, "I have to re-examine my memory banks on this, and this looks like the moment that the hatch blew." So when we heard that, we knew we were onto something. But, and there are other people who say maybe Gus Grissom bumped it on the armed hatch unintentionally. He's bobbing around in the ocean. One of the things he did in the sequence was there was a survival knife attached to the hatch door, and Gus said he had been thinking about, I'd really like to keep that knife because it was custom made. Well, I went through the whole sequence. It turns out that he removed that knife from the hatch door, stowed it underneath in his kit, and then he armed the hatch. So it wasn't like he was messing around in the area near the hatch. And it would have been very difficult for him, even bobbing around as he was, to bump into the armed hatch.
I think they tried to reenact that, didn't they?
They
Gus
did.
The capsule, and I couldn't get into the position that this plunger was, so they just didn't believe that was a possibility.
And again, when they were looking for sneak circuits and what may have happened later on, there was no way to recreate these conditions. The spacecraft bobbing in 80-degree water with a UH-34D helicopter hovering over it, and creating all this prop wash and all this static electricity. So that's why we think this is the most plausible explanation for what happened.
If you actually do a Google search even today and just put helicopter static electricity, you'll see a lot. It's still obviously an issue. It's more so over dry, sandy conditions, for example. So the rotor blades are hitting the grains of sand, or over snowy conditions. But it can generate like tens of thousands of volts in static. So it is a known thing. This isn't an unusual things happen.
And as the point we make, static electricity tends to take the path of least resistance.
Actually, Robert Trevino here asked this question, just to follow up on that. Was the cookie cutter Shepherd's Hook dipped into the water first to discharge static electricity? He says he remembers in Navy water survival training, the water was dipped into the water first before people grabbed it, I guess. So that would be, that kind of speaks to what you're saying. This is an issue.
Right.
You can't see that in the film.
Okay.
So it's as they approach, that first point of contact is the pole as the helicopter comes in. So whether that should have happened and it didn't, or whether it just wasn't considered a big enough issue, we don't know. Mm-hmm. But certainly what happens now is you were ground the aircraft.
Okay, so it looks like Mike Neufeld, Mike's asking, what did Scott Carpenter do as he was 250 miles long and had to wait for recovery? When he was found, he was in his life raft. Did he blow the hatch or crawl out of the neck of the capsule? I think you mentioned this actually. There
were two ways to exit the spacecraft, and Scott Carpenter used the second alternative. He went out the neck, and what that involved was you had to remove the dashboard and come up and squeeze your way out through the top of the spacecraft, and then he made sure his lifeboat was inflated properly. He got out. He sat in the water for well over an hour, I think, until they located him. And he said it was actually nice and peaceful. He didn't mind it at all. But of course, he caught hell for coming in 250 miles long and never flew again. So that was the one instance where they used that other point of egress. So his hatch was not blown.
Yeah. Okay, and Brian Page asks, was the investigation for this thing obviously was probably was this static scenario examined at the time during the initial investigation?
Yeah, they did look at it, and I think they were looking for sneak circuits in the electrical system and so forth. But again, there was no way you could in 1961 you could duplicate the conditions on January or July 21st, 1961, 300 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. So they wrapped this up pretty quickly. What you have to keep in mind here is they're in a big hurry, right? They're right at this point. The Soviets are kicking our rear ends. We want to get a man in orbit. So that I think Bob Gilruth made a decision. Let's move on. Okay, we're going to change our procedures. We got to concentrate on Glenn's orbital flight, which of course was delayed. As Jeff Schessel points out, I think 6 or 8 times before it finally went up in February of '62. So that's what you have to keep in mind. But, they wanted to move on, and I think they tried to be as exhaustive as they could. But if you read the post-mission report, this is sort of glossed over. And because it was sort of glossed over, as Bob Voa said, it blame devolved onto the astronaut. And what these guys wanted was they wanted to get a flight, and they didn't want to screw up. So this was, Gus Grissom licked his wounds for about 8 months after this, and then he got back up on the saddle and he went out to the desert and started testing the Parasev that was considered as a way to land the Gemini spacecraft, and flew a couple of flights on that where he got towed by another aircraft. It was really dangerous, but he was sort of, I think it was sort of him getting back in the saddle, and he came in and proposed it. Wally Schirra said, "No, we're not going to do that, Gus."
All right. Well, I guess a last question for each of you. Same question, George. What's next? What's your you turn from one research to another. What direction are you going now? Something that's interesting to you?
Well, I continue to follow this as we all do. I was working on a project about the secret history of Silicon Valley, which actually goes back to World War II, but I'm still working on that one. And I'm also at Roger Launius's suggestion. I'm also looking at the folks at JPL who were as important as von Braun and the folks in Huntsville in terms of how we got to the moon. So that's a potential subject. But in the meantime, I'm waiting for Andy Saunders' great book to come out.
Oh, that's a choice. Yeah, and that's really what I'm working on completing it. It's pretty much complete. It's available for pre-order, but it's not out until next year. Sounds like I might be going on a bit of a trip with Stevens later to find this film that was created on 7. See if we anything we do with that. That's a new job just allocated. Thank you, George. But yeah, the book's out next year, and in the meantime, I just continue to try and make these historic images look as good as they can and as good as they deserve to be. And I put those on Twitter, I put them on Instagram, and I share them, and they'll be all in the book next year. I'll continue to do that.
And so I guess kind of along the same line, Andy. So if you had the time and the bandwidth to focus on, and you had access to some footage that you could really apply this technique to, does anything jump out in your mind? What's the what's what would be something you'd really want to zoom in on, I guess, both figuratively and literally?
The first step would be very nice to find, Neil Armstrong's first footprint, which I think might be possible, but only with access to the original film, and I don't know if NASA will let me in as yet. And also that EVA footage, I think, needs to be rescanned. So the footage that are used to show Armstrong's face, that's could be better, I think. And it's been a long time since that was scanned, so perhaps Stephen Slater could help in that process and get that original film rescanned as well. That's due for a rescan, I think. So that'd be great to get hold of. That kind of file would be incredible.
And there's a ton of Project Gemini stuff you could work on, right?
Gemini may well be next, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very good. And I guess that leads me to the most important point here for historians and scholars of all kinds, having access to this footage, making sure this stuff is preserved, maintained until the technology catches up that we could do these great things, right? So, this is where technology is now. If we have the archives there, if we preserve this footage, make it available 50, 100 years from now, what might we be able to do with that footage? So, just a final plea from the historical community here. So that's something we definitely take very seriously at the agency.
Andy's work is a great example of open source, and look what he's found in this old 16mm footage, and the same with the work that Stephen Slater does and what Ben Feist has been doing with the Apollo missions, and it makes it it makes it real. People understand the risks these guys took to do what we did, and we did what we said we would do.
Yeah. Sadly, the actual film will degrade over time, that analog film, sadly. Yeah. So that won't get any better, but the technology to get the data out of that film does get better. So it's combining those two things.
Good point. Good point. Okay, guys. Well, I know one thing that I've seen in the chat here is a lot of just congratulations and thank yous for this great presentation and great work that you've done, both of you. And so I definitely commend. It's just fantastic, and I've enjoyed listening to you here, and look forward to the next thing that both of you work on. So again, thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully we'll have something for you again very soon. It'd be tough to match this one though.
Thanks, Brian.
All right. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy and George. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.